All right, ready to dive in to something pretty fascinating.
I'm all ears.
The Tao Te Ching,
Oh, okay. Yeah. I know a little bit about it.
ancient Chinese text, right?
Mhm.
With all those kind of like poetic verses and philosophical ideas.
Right.
So it's like the foundation of Taoism.
Yeah. Yeah.
But here's the thing. We're not trying to like get a PhD in Taoism or anything.
Sure.
It's more like, let's think of this as a treasure hunt.
Okay.
And we're sifting through all this ancient wisdom
Okay. Yeah.
to see if we can find some nuggets
Yeah.
that apply to like our modern lives.
Right.
And you know, it's interesting.
What's that?
The Tao Te Ching kind of tells us right off the bat that we can't really get the Tao just by like reading about it.
Oh, interesting. So, like, it's more than just words on a page.
Yeah.
How would you describe it then?
It's like trying to explain the essence of life itself. You know,
Yeah.
you can describe its characteristics,
Mm-hmm.
but like the core of what makes something alive,
Uh,
that's almost beyond words.
I see. Yeah. So, to understand it, we kind of have to go beyond just the intellectual, heady stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like the Tao Te Ching starts with this line.
Okay.
The Tao that can be described is not the eternal Tao. So if it's beyond definition,
Right.
how do we even start to wrap our heads around it?
That's a good question.
I know, right?
So, I mean, if you had to try to define it, or at least point towards what it is, where would you even begin?
Well, maybe instead of thinking of it as like a thing,
Okay.
think of it as more of a principle,
Okay.
like this underlying force that kind of drives the whole universe.
Mm-hmm.
So like gravity, we don't really understand its essence,
Sure.
but we see its effects everywhere.
Right.
It's always working, even if we don't see it.
Yeah.
So the Tao is kind of like that.
So it's this underlying force that shapes everything, even if we don't always recognize it.
Yeah, and our world is so obsessed with like labels and definitions.
Right. Like we need to put everything in a neat little box.
Exactly. So how do we even begin to understand something that defies like easy categorization?
That's a good point. Yeah. It's like the Tao Te Ching is almost pushing back against that very urge, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe that's exactly the point it's trying to make.
It is, actually. Like, it's kind of encouraging us to step back from our need to constantly define and label things, because sometimes those, like, deepest truths,
Yeah.
they're not just intellectual. They're meant to be experienced.
I like that. Experience over just thinking about it.
Yeah.
So how do we even begin to live in harmony with this elusive Tao?
Right.
Because the text is full of all these paradoxes and contradictions,
Mm.
which honestly can be a bit overwhelming at first.
Yeah.
Like, where do you even begin?
It's true. I mean, that's part of what makes it so intriguing, right? The paradoxes are a big part of the challenge.
Yeah.
And also the beauty of the Tao Te Ching. Like, for example,
Yeah.
it emphasizes, like, strength that you find in yielding and power in non-action. And, I mean, that's kind of a mind bender for those of us who are so used to, like, striving and pushing for what we want.
Yeah. So instead of always being on, always striving,
Right.
are we supposed to just give up and let life happen to us?
That's not quite it. It's not about passivity, but more like a shift in perspective.
Okay.
So think of it like this. When we try to, like, force our will on the world, that often creates a lot of resistance.
Yeah.
So the Tao Te Ching, it's encouraging us to, like, find alignment with the natural flow of things.
Right.
To work with the Tao instead of against it.
So how does that, like this concept of non-action,
Right.
how does that actually play out in real life?
Yeah.
It's easy to talk about going with the flow, but we still have to make decisions and take action. Right?
Yeah. It's not about doing nothing.
Okay.
It's more about choosing our actions thoughtfully
Yeah.
and making sure that they're aligned with, like, the natural flow of events. And the Tao Te Ching is full of all this vivid imagery to try to illustrate this concept.
Oh, right. Like that verse about the Tao being like water.
Exactly.
It says, nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water. Yet for attacking the hard and strong, nothing can surpass it.
Exactly. So it's a really counterintuitive idea, but
Yeah.
you see it everywhere in nature.
Yeah, for sure.
Like the way that water carves canyons, right? Over time, it doesn't force its way through.
Right.
It finds the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
And yet its power is undeniable.
It's like a natural judo move. You don't meet force with force.
Yeah, exactly.
You redirect it, use its momentum to your advantage.
I like that analogy.
So how could we use that kind of approach, that water approach, in like a conflict situation at work, for instance?
That's a good question. So imagine instead of like a immediately pushing back against someone's opposing view.
Yeah.
You first try to understand their perspective, by listening, acknowledging their points. You might uncover some common ground.
Right.
And then you can find like a more harmonious solution.
So it's not about being passive, but like choosing your battles.
Yeah.
Being strategic about how you exert your energy.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how this ancient philosophy can have some really practical applications.
For sure, yeah.
But what about leadership?
Okay.
How does the Tao Te Ching view like effective leadership?
Oh, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
Because it really challenges our typical ideas about what makes a strong leader. So the Tao Te Ching suggests that true leadership, it's not about ego or control, but about empowering others and creating an environment where things can naturally flourish.
Interesting.
And it even says this, the best leaders are those the people hardly know exist.
Wow. So it's like the opposite of those charismatic take charge leaders that we're so used to seeing.
Exactly.
So how does a leader embody this invisible style?
That's a good question. So imagine a leader who, instead of like dictating every move, focuses on like guiding and supporting their team and creating an environment of trust where everyone feels empowered to contribute their best.
It's almost like a gardener who doesn't like force the plants to grow, but just creates the right conditions for them to thrive naturally.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Tao Te Ching actually uses the imagery of the leader as like a watershed. Gently guiding and directing without forcefully intervening.
So subtle.
Yes.
Yet powerful.
Very much so.
I like that.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting when we talk about creating the right conditions, right? The Tao Te Ching really stresses that like inner cultivation is the path to real strength. It's not just about leading other people, but leading ourselves well too.
So instead of always looking for validation outside of ourselves, like externally, or trying to control everything around us.
Exactly.
We should be turning inward.
Right, turning inward. And that's where, these ideas of like self-knowledge come in. Humility, contentment.
Those are big ones.
They are. And honestly, they can seem a little counterintuitive in a world that's all about ambition and like external achievements.
Yeah, for sure. It's almost like the Tao Te Ching is suggesting like whole different set of values.
It is a real
different way of measuring success. Like there's that line, knowing you don't know is wholeness.
Right.
I mean, how can not knowing be a good thing?
It's definitely a paradox.
Right. It's like counterintuitive.
Totally. It is, yeah. But what the Tao Te Ching is getting at is that true wisdom starts with acknowledging the limits of our own knowledge, So that's where real humility comes in, because you're recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
Right.
And that's okay.
It's almost like the more we cling to the idea that we know something, the more closed off we become to new information.
Exactly.
New possibilities.
Right. And that kind of closed-mindedness, that can be a real obstacle to personal growth.
Sure.
And you know what the Tao Te Ching encourages us to cultivate?
What's that?
A beginner's mind.
Oh, okay.
An openness to like learning and exploring,
Yeah.
Without that rigid certainty.
So being okay with saying, like, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, have you ever thought you knew something for sure?
Oh, all the time.
Right.
And then later, your perspective totally shifted.
Yeah. I mean, that happens all the time. It's like, when I thought I knew everything about parenting, and then my kids became teenagers.
Exactly.
And suddenly I was like, back at square one.
It's like you have no idea what you're doing.
Totally. But you know what? Those moments of unknowing, they can be really valuable.
How so?
Because they force us to re-examine those assumptions, right?
Yeah.
And be more open to new ways of seeing the world. And that's how we actually grow.
So if we're embracing the idea of not knowing everything, how do we make decisions? Because it feels like we're constantly bombarded with like information.
So much information.
Choices.
Yeah.
How do we like choose wisely without second guessing ourselves all the time?
That's a great question. And the Tao Te Ching has like a really interesting take on making decisions.
Okay.
It's not about like agonizing over every little choice or trying to predict the future, right? It's more about cultivating the sense of like inner stillness, a
Yeah.
connection to our own intuition,
Okay.
so that we can act in alignment with that natural flow of things, with the Tao.
Okay, but how do you develop inner stillness? It's not like we can just like flip a switch and tune out all the noise of the world.
You're right. It definitely takes practice, and the Tao Te Ching kind of points to practices like meditation,
Okay,
mindfulness,
right.
and these can help us create that space between our thoughts,
What?
which lets us access that deeper wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
that might be drowned out by all that mental chatter.
So it's not about emptying our minds completely,
Right.
but learning to observe those thoughts without getting like swept away by them.
Exactly. Yes. And from that place of greater awareness, then we can make choices that are more aligned with our values
Right.
and with the natural flow of the Tao.
So self-knowledge, humility.
Yeah.
What about contentment? How does that fit in?
That's a good one. Contentment, in the context of the Tao Te Ching, it's not about like settling
Okay.
or being passive.
Right.
It's about finding this deep sense of peace
Mm-hmm.
and satisfaction
Okay.
with who we are
Right.
and what we have right here, right now.
Yeah. That's a tough one though, right?
It is.
Especially in a culture that's always pushing us to want more,
Always more.
to never be satisfied with what we've got.
Yeah. It's definitely a challenge. But you know what the Tao Te Ching reminds us?
What's that?
That chasing after all that external validation, those material possessions, that stuff won't bring us lasting happiness.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a verse that says, "Those who know they have enough are truly wealthy."
Mm.
What do you think it means to know you have enough?
It's a good question. I guess it's about recognizing that, like the abundance that's already present in our lives, instead of always focusing on what we lack.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about appreciating those simple things,
Right.
like our health,
Yeah.
our relationships,
About connection.
the beauty of nature.
Yeah, that's beautifully put.
It's like, it's a shift in perspective, right? Recognizing that real wealth isn't measured by like bank accounts or possessions.
Right.
It's about our inner state of being.
And I've definitely been caught up in that trap of wanting more,
Yeah.
like a bigger house, a nicer car.
Sure.
And in the end, those things never really brought me any lasting happiness.
That's so common, though. It's such a common trap in the modern world.
Yeah.
But the Tao Te Ching, it offers us a different path.
Okay.
One that leads us inward towards a more sustainable and like authentic sense of fulfillment.
So it's about finding contentment, not in what we acquire, but in who we are.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that inner peace
Right.
and resilience.
Yeah.
And those are qualities that are so essential for navigating all the ups and downs of life.
Right. So much of it seems to be about this shift in perspective.
It is.
So how do we actually cultivate these things?
Yeah.
Self-knowledge, humility,
Right.
contentment.
Good question. Well, the Tao Te Ching, it offers us some pretty practical guidance
Okay.
in the form of these really simple yet powerful practices.
Like what?
We've talked about like meditation,
Yeah.
right? Mindfulness.
Yeah.
But there are others that can be really helpful too.
Okay, I'm all ears. What else is there?
Well, one that comes to mind is gratitude.
Oh.
Just taking a few minutes every day to think about the things that we're grateful for,
Right.
it can have such a huge impact on our well-being. You know, it shifts our focus from what we lack to what we already have. And that helps cultivate contentment and abundance.
Yeah, just that simple act of pausing, right? To appreciate the good things in our lives instead of constantly rushing on to the next thing.
Exactly. And another one that Tao Te Ching talks about is living in harmony with nature.
Okay.
Spending time outdoors, connecting with the natural world.
Right.
That can help us reconnect with a sense of peace and simplicity that we can lose in the hustle of modern life.
It's like hitting the reset button on our nervous systems.
Totally.
Yeah, no, when I'm feeling like stressed or overwhelmed, just going for a walk in the park makes a big difference.
It's true. Nature is amazing like that.
Yeah.
It has this power to ground us, right?
Yeah.
To remind us of the bigger picture
Yeah.
and to help us see our own challenges with a new perspective.
So it's not just about reading the Tao Te Ching and understanding it intellectually. It's about putting it into practice.
Exactly. It's about embodying that wisdom, not just knowing it in our heads.
This whole exploration of the Tao Te Ching, it really feels like this journey of self-discovery.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. We've talked about the Tao and how we can't really define it.
Right.
Finding strength in yielding, the importance of cultivating our inner selves.
Right.
All these ideas that really challenge like our normal ways of thinking.
I know. It's kind of a mind bender, but in a good way.
Yeah, for sure. What else stands out to you as we wrap up this whole deep dive?
Well, I think one of the most important things is how the Tao Te Ching puts so much emphasis on simplicity
Okay.
and balance.
Right.
And, these might seem like ancient principles,
Sure.
but they offer a really powerful, antidote to all the complexity and anxiety in modern life.
I mean, that's so true. We're constantly bombarded with information and pressure to achieve. It's this never-ending cycle of doing, doing, doing.
Right.
So the idea of simplicity, slowing down,
Yeah.
it feels almost like radical.
It really does. It's like going against the grain. And yet the Tao Te Ching is saying that it's in that simplicity that we find real clarity and peace.
Like that verse about governing a big country being like frying a small fish.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Too much poking and prodding will just ruin it.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between action and non-action.
Okay.
Effort and just allowing things to be.
So how does that less is more approach actually work in our daily lives?
Well, think about your to-do list.
Okay.
So instead of trying to cram in as much as you can, what if you just focused on one or two of the most important tasks each day?
Okay.
You give those tasks your full attention, you do them really well, and then you let go of that need to do everything at once.
So it's about being more intentional with our time and energy, prioritizing what really matters.
Exactly. And, that can apply to so many other parts of life, too.
Yeah.
Like how we manage our schedules, how
Yeah.
we take in information.
Yeah.
It's about creating space for what's truly important
Okay.
and not letting ourselves get swept up in all the demands of the world around us.
It's like we're not just decluttering our physical spaces, but also our mental and emotional spaces, too.
Exactly. Clearing out the clutter so we can focus on what matters.
Right.
Yeah. And remember how the Tao Te Ching also talks about balance? Finding that middle way between extremes.
Right.
There's that line that says, be careful of going to extremes. Bend a bow too far and it breaks. It's a good reminder that pushing too hard in any one direction, that can lead to imbalance.
Yeah.
And then eventually harm.
So it's not about giving up on ambition or effort completely.
Right.
It's more about finding a rhythm that's sustainable, a pace that lets us thrive without burning ourselves out.
Yeah. How do you think this idea of balance works in our relationships?
So instead of always trying to be right, we could try to approach conversations with a willingness to listen,
Right.
to try to understand the other person's perspective.
Yeah.
And even if we disagree, we can do it respectfully.
Exactly.
But for common ground, instead of just trying to dominate the conversation.
You got it. It's about finding that middle path.
Right.
Where it seems like opposite forces can actually coexist.
Yeah, like the yin and yang symbol.
Yes, exactly like that. It's a dynamic kind of balance, It's this dance between these opposing forces that brings about wholeness.
I'm really starting to see how deep and connected all these ideas are.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
It's not just about understanding these concepts one by one.
Right.
It's about how they all work together to create a more harmonious way of living.
Exactly. It's about seeing the whole picture, the interconnectedness of it all. And I think that's why the Tao Te Ching is still so relevant today.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it speaks to this deep desire we all have for balance, connection, meaning,
Yeah.
in a world that can feel really chaotic and overwhelming.
So what would you say to someone listening who's thinking, okay, this Tao stuff is interesting, but how do I actually bring it into my life?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And honestly, the Tao Te Ching, it's not like this one-size-fits-all thing. It's
Right.
more like a guidebook,
Okay.
a collection of wisdom that kind of invites your own interpretation and how you're going to use it.
Okay.
So, what really speaks to you? What feels most relevant to your life and what you're going through?
So it's more about finding our own path, but letting those Taoist principles guide us.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
not about becoming some Taoist scholar. It's
Yeah.
about weaving these ancient principles into our daily lives in a way that feels right for us. It's about making small changes,
Yes.
step by step,
Right.
that gradually shift our perspective and how we are in the world.
So it's like we're going on this lifelong journey of self-discovery, but the wisdom of the Tao is our guide.
That's a beautiful way to put it, yeah. And you know what? I think we can all benefit from a little more Taoist wisdom in our lives,
For sure.
especially now when things feel like they're constantly changing.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We talked about the Tao and how we can't really grasp it fully. The power of non-action,
Yeah.
cultivating our inner selves.
It's all connected, right?
It is, yeah. And how these ancient teachings are still relevant today.
Exactly.
I have to say, this deep dive into the Tao Te Ching with you has been so enriching.
It has been fun.
What a fascinating text.
It really is. It's one of those books you can keep coming back to,
Yeah.
and you find new things every time.
So, to wrap things up, let's leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, I like that.
If the Tao is about effortless action and letting things happen naturally, how do we apply that to our own lives? I mean, is it about letting go of control,
Right.
or is it about finding a deeper connection with all those forces around us?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's a bit of both.
That's such a good question to think about. I mean, that's something we each have to kind of figure out for ourselves
Yeah,
on our own journeys.
I like that. So it's really all about exploration and discovery.
It is.
As beautifully put. Maybe that's the true heart of the Tao.
Mm-hmm.
This constant journey of searching,
Yeah.
questioning,
Right.
finding our own way.
I think you might be right. Maybe that is the biggest lesson of all.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Tao Te Ching. We hope you'll explore this amazing book for yourselves and see what wisdom you find in it. Until next time, keep searching, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.